Hi, welcome to Mary Magdalene and Archeology, fresh insights from new discoveries and ancient relics. I'm Anne Regimbal, and I'm the author of Mary Magdalene's Stations of the Cross. This book, which was released in April of 2020, is a reframing of the Stations of the Cross from the perspective of Mary Magdalene, and it focuses on bringing out a lot of the characteristics of Mary Magdalene that so many of us admire so much: her courage, her strength, her loyalty, and her tremendous determination. But because I love history and archaeology, I interwove all of those things into the book. And today we're going to focus on archaeology. I should mention also that a portion of the proceeds from sales of Mary Magdalene's Stations of the Cross will be donated to the Magdala Archeology Project in Israel. So, obviously today we're going to talk about the archaeology of Magdala, but we're also going to touch on three of the most interesting artifacts of biblical archaeology anywhere in the world that also have a Mary Magdalene angle. And I hope you'll enjoy some of these insights and walk away perhaps with some fresh thoughts about Mary Magdalene from this presentation. So thank you so much for your time. Let's start with Magdala, and we'll begin with a little bit of geography. Here's a map of Israel. And here we have Jerusalem right there in the center. Magdala was up here on the Sea of Galilee. It's quite a distance from Magdala to Jerusalem. In fact, even today, it takes about 2 hours to drive it by car. It would have taken over a week for most people in the first century to make that trip, maybe even longer. Another town that I'll just point out quickly while we have the map here is Bethany. Why is that important? Well, there's been confusion for going back to about the 6th century that Mary Magdalene was the same person of Mary of Bethany. Mary Bethany, of course, is the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and in the Bible, she is someone who anoints Jesus' feet with nard and wipes them with her hair. And these two Marys have long been confused. In 1969, they were officially separated, if you will. They each have their separate feast day within the Catholic Church. But there's long been a confusion between the two, and I think it's just sort of interesting to point out how far apart these two towns really were. Magdala was up here on the Sea of Galilee. Bethany is essentially almost a suburb of Jerusalem. It's just on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And so this was a fair distance between these two places. So it's probably not the same person lady who came from each of these different towns. Another point that is interesting, and we'll talk about it during the presentation on Magdala, is Caesarea Maritima, which is right here on the coast on the Mediterranean Sea. This was a very sophisticated Roman city. It was the main port to Judea in the 1st century, and Pontius Pilate actually lived in Caesarea. A lot of people think he lived in Jerusalem. He did not. He lived here. We'll do another video later on Pontius Pilate and other people who figure in the Stations of the Cross. But why Caesarea is important today is that, as you'll learn, many of the products from Magdala, which were, this town was very involved in international trade and finance, were shipped over the Mediterranean Sea out of the port of Caesarea Maritima to Rome and other places in the ancient world. So that map is a little bit of an underpinning in terms of some of the things we're going to be talking about today. Let's do a deeper dive and take a look at the Sea of Galilee region. Here we have Magdala right here, and Capernaum, where Jesus had his headquarters, is up just a bit north. And it's about a 2-hour walk from Capernaum to Magdala. Less time probably by boat. So it's quite navigable. Someone could easily have gone there for a day or a very short trip. Tiberias also features in the New Testament. Obviously, this is where Herod had his court at Tiberias. And this is very short distance between Magdala and Tiberias. I think it's about 5.5 miles. And we'll talk later about a good friend of Mary Magdalene's who actually lived in Tiberias. And so it's useful to just sort of see how these three towns interconnect on the Sea of Galilee. The town of Magdala was destroyed in 67. As you'll recall from reading the New Testament, all the time that Jesus is, ministering to people in Judea, they are waiting for a Messiah, and they want someone to free the Jewish people from the Roman occupation that they are subjected to at that time. 33 years after the crucifixion, there is a rebellion of Jewish people against the Roman rulers of the time. And in the beginning, the Jewish rebels do very, very well, and they manage to defeat the Romans and take back the country. However, about a year later, Vespasian, who later becomes the Roman emperor, and his son Titus, they mount an attack in the Galilee region and destroy many towns there, including Magdala. This is a very significant but also very bloody battle. And Flavius Josephus, who is a well-regarded historian of the time, described this conflict as follows. He said, "The Sea of Galilee was red with blood. The shores were strewn with swollen carcasses." And it was at that point in 67 where ancient Magdala was destroyed, and it basically remained undiscovered for nearly 2,000 years. This gentleman here is Father Juan Solana. He's a Catholic priest, and I refer to him sometimes as the accidental archaeologist, because I don't think he really intended to have become as involved in one of the most important discoveries in biblical archaeology of our time. In 2006, Father Juan began developing a project to build a pilgrimage center on the Sea of Galilee. As you saw from the map, it's quite a distance between Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee, and he thought it would be a lovely idea to have a spiritual center where people would stay overnight, they could have conferences, that sort of thing on the Sea of Galilee. And he was particularly interested in Magdala as the site, partly because his mother's personal devotion to St. Mary Magdalene. But there was another reason too. Believe it or not, there had been a Hawaiian-themed resort. Yes, I cannot make this up. Someone came up with the idea that it would be really cool to have a Hawaiian-themed resort on the Sea of Galilee with luau's and these sorts of things. Needless to say, this idea didn't generate a lot of business, and eventually the Hawaiian resort went bankrupt. It was right around Magdala, and Father Juan was able to acquire that land from the Hawaiian village, I think it was called, for a very reasonable price. And that was sort of the core of the land at Magdala that he had to start developing out his plans. Over the next 3 years, he acquired the neighboring properties, and he finally had a package together where he had blueprints and he had hired construction crews, and he was ready to start work. So this is 2009. However, in Israel, there is a law which is that if you're going to have a major construction project in an area of historical importance, which is almost the entire country of Israel, but particularly the area around the Sea of Galilee, first, the Israeli Antiquities Authority has to conduct a salvage dig to make sure that you're not going to build over any area of archaeological or historical importance. And they need to greenlight that project before the construction can begin. So the IAA sent a team of archaeologists to conduct a salvage dig on Father Juan's property. And initially they were digging down by the water, and that's where they expected to really find anything that might have been of interest. They didn't find too much, a lot of fishing hooks, but not much else. So finally they went up to the north part of the property, and to everyone's amazement, they struck a series of benches. And as they dug further, they realized that they had unearthed a first-century synagogue. And amazingly, it was buried only about 1.5 feet beneath the surface. It had been buried for 2,000 years. Now, what's amazing about that, here is the first-century synagogue. If you read the New Testament, it talks about Jesus went around the towns of the Sea of Galilee and preached in their synagogues. This is, I believe, the first one ever found. So that in itself is amazing, but there are many other fascinating things about this particular discovery. You can see here, this is the interior of the synagogue. And I think the first thing that probably strikes you is this beautiful mosaic. this shows how luxuriously appointed this synagogue was. This was obviously a very wealthy congregation that was able to finance this kind of decoration of this beautiful synagogue. And somebody right now is actually studying these tiles and the mosaics because the colors are very unusual. This we will talk about shortly. This has been called by Smithsonian Magazine one of the most important discoveries in biblical archaeology since the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is called the Magdala Stone, and it was found right almost in the center of the synagogue when it was unearthed in 2009. Something else that they have found also is this fragment of a brightly painted fresco, and some of the pigment, as you can see, is still intact, which is amazing. And it also shows how beautifully decorated the walls of the synagogue would have been. And this, of course, is the Magdala Stone. So let's dive in and talk about that and why it's so important. As you can see here, here's a menorah depicted on one side of the stone and two amphora jars beside it. And over here is the wheels of fire, the chariots of fire. And this is a really interesting carving. And scholars have studied this for more than a decade now since it was unearthed. What most believe is depicted on the Magdala Stone is what you would see if you actually were in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. And this is very interesting because it was such restricted access to that inner sanctum of the Jerusalem temple. The high priest, someone like Joseph Caiaphas, would have clearly had access to that. Perhaps some of the other priests, maybe one or two senior members of the Sanhedrin, but it was a very limited access to the Holy of Holies. But whoever either carved the Magdala Stone or ordered it to be carved clearly knew what was there. They had seen it or heard of it at least, but probably had actually visited. So that in itself is very interesting. Most scholars seem to believe that the Magdala Stone was a table for the reading of Torah scrolls. And of course, that prompts the question, did Jesus potentially teach in this synagogue? And did he even possibly read from the Torah above, from standing in front of the Magdala Stone? And most people feel that he probably did because of this discovery here. Several years after Magdala was unearthed in 2009, the archaeological park was opened, and students from around the world were allowed to come at different times and participate in the archaeological dig. And one student discovered this coin right here. This was a coin minted in Tiberias in 29, and it was found in an antechamber of the Magdala Synagogue. And so the date of the coin suggests that the synagogue was in operation at the time of Jesus' ministry. As you'll recall, the crucifixion occurred in 33, so 29 is right at the time, and a year or two after is right at the time he would have been preaching in the Galilee. And obviously the synagogue was in operation then. So it looks like fairly good evidence that Jesus may very well have taught there, particularly as it's only a 2-hour walk between Magdala and Capernaum. You can see here, this is sort of an aerial view of the synagogue. It's not that large, and this is intriguing as well. It's only about 36 feet by 36 feet, maybe 200 people at the most could be in that synagogue at one time. And what's intriguing about that is that the town of Magdala itself was predominantly a Jewish population, and there were many more than 200 people that lived there. So where did the others worship? How did that all work? What's also interesting is that traditionally, synagogues of that era were located in the center of town. This one is to the north. It's actually the part of Magdala that's closest to Capernaum. So there are some scholars who are suggesting that perhaps this was a breakaway sect that some have even suggested maybe this is a group of followers specifically of Jesus that built this well-appointed and small, very ornate little synagogue nearer to Capernaum. So far, there's no evidence that supports that. But interestingly, one of the archaeologists who had worked on the dig at Magdala for several years told Smithsonian Magazine that in her opinion, no small temple that was that finely decorated would probably have been built without some sort of charismatic leader. So that opens the way to some very interesting conjecture about the synagogue, given its size and given its placement. But what we know for sure from the things we've seen here, the frescoes, the mosaics, this was actually, they found a tool that would have been used in the worship services at the synagogue, beautifully decorated, is that this was a very, very wealthy and sophisticated congregation. And that, I think, is really the biggest takeaway in some respects from this particular find. Now, another thing that was found at Magdala that is particularly interesting in terms of Mary Magdalene were 4 Jewish ritual baths, which are known as, I'll probably butcher the pronunciation, mikvahs. And they were discovered here. One of them is pictured here. What were these? Well, observant Jewish women used mikvah baths whenever the Jewish purification laws required it, which for a woman of childbearing age was once a month. And I would suspect that any woman who was released from 7 demons would probably have purified herself after that experience in one of these ritual baths as well. And we know that Mary Magdalene was an observant Jewish woman. So I think the chances are pretty good that Mary Magdalene actually bathed right here. And so I think that's a very exciting find from the Magdala archaeology. One other thing I'll mention about the mikvah baths is that they used a very sophisticated water system. In fact, this type of engineering was not seen again until the Middle Ages in Europe. And this is yet another indication of the affluence of the Jewish community in first century Magdala. Which begs the question, why was the town so affluent? And in a word, fish. Magdala was a town that was heavily involved in the processing of fish and its international sale. And we aren't just talking about fresh fish, but dried, salted, pickled fish. They made a fish paste, and there was a popular fish sauce at that time called garum. And at least 4 ancient writers refer to the popularity and the esteem of the fish of Magdala, or Tirchi, which is Magdala's name in Greek, throughout the ancient world. The fish of Tirchi was sold in the markets of Rome. It was a cachet product, somewhat like Norwegian smoked salmon today. So what was going on at Magdala was a very sophisticated food business that involved international trade. And some of the archaeological finds really give a lot of evidence around that. In the marketplace itself, archaeologists have found over 4,000 ancient coins, and from different countries as well, 300 fishing weights. So it shows, the extent of this type of commerce. They found evidence of mobile glass manufacturing, and that obviously would have supported this industry in terms of ways to pack the fish so that it could be transported across the Mediterranean and sold in Rome and elsewhere. They also found a holding pool that was over 40 feet in diameter. It was found very close to the shoreline so that the boats on the Sea of Galilee could unload their catches there. And there was a marketplace that had more than 28 shops. Again, for a town of this size, this was a very sophisticated and affluent community to be able to have a marketplace like that. So this just shows as well, these were the holding tanks. Some think they were salting pools, but they were clearly places that played a role in the preparation of the fish for this industry. The team at Magdala reconstructed, it's a much smaller version, it's not 40 feet, the big holding pool that had originally been down at the shoreline. They used original stones, and they've actually put it in the lobby of the hotel that they finally opened. Yes, Father Juan finally did get to build his spiritual retreat at Magdala, and it opened last November, the hotel there, which is absolutely beautiful. And in the lobby is a reconstruction on a smaller scale of that holding tank that had been down at the shoreline. Another thing that the archaeologists found were multi-room dwellings, and they refer to these as villas. They may have been part of a business arrangement. It could have been some kind of warehousing, but they're thought to be residential. And they were found near the Magdala marketplace. If they were multi-leveled, they would have had a very delightful view out over the Sea of Galilee. So what this suggests is that this tremendous economic activity and international trade that the town of Magdalene was involved in the fishing industry certainly allowed some of its citizens to live in great style and great comfort. So this, of course, poses the question, does this mean that Mary Magdalene was wealthy? Well, the archaeology clearly shows that Mary Magdalene came from a very prosperous town. But was she one of Magdala's elite? We know that she was an independent woman because she's not referred to as the wife of anyone or the mother of someone's sons, as many of the other women in the New Testament are. She's always referred to as Mary of Magdala, her town. So might she have been the widow of a successful Magdalene businessman? Might she have even been the heiress to a fishing fortune? Women often did not inherit property in those days, but it was possible if she had not had siblings, or there may have been reasons for that. What we can be pretty sure of is that she probably wasn't one of those shopkeepers in those 28 shops in the Magdala marketplace, because she wouldn't have had the luxury to have left her shop probably to follow Jesus and his disciples during his ministry. Or was she, as she's been portrayed for many centuries, a poor prostitute who plied her trade with the town's many fishermen? I'm not sure that we'll ever know for sure, and I'm not sure we're going to find anything in the archaeology that will tell us that, although you never know. But one of the most interesting lenses to give us some insight on which of these two identities might be most likely for Mary Magdalene actually comes from the New Testament itself. And it's her friend. She had a very prominent friend and wealthy friend who lived in Tiberias, and her name was Joanna. Luke talks about Mary Magdalene and Joanna being together. Luke even writes that Joanna was with Mary Magdalene on Easter morning at the tomb and was also one of the witnesses to the resurrection. So what we know about Joanna is that she was the wife of Herod's steward Chusa. And Herod lived in Tiberias. We know that Tiberias is very close to Magdala as well. And Joanna probably lived there, and undoubtedly Mary and Joanna were able to spend time together because of the proximity of the two towns. So what is a steward? Well, a steward is not a butler. He actually would have been in charge of Herod's financial affairs and the running of Herod's household. So he, in modern parlance, might have been thought of as the chief operating officer, chief financial officer of Herod Inc. He was a very highly placed official in Herod's court, and therefore his wife Joanna would have been a woman of wealth and high status in the Galilee region. What's interesting is that when the two women are mentioned in the New Testament, Mary Magdalene is always given prominence. She's always mentioned first amongst all of the women. There may be many explanations for that, but one certainly could be that Mary Magdalene might have been a woman of even higher social standing than Joanna. And something that we certainly see from the discovery at Magdala, the archaeology there, is what a wealthy town it was. And there were certainly affluent people there. It's also unlikely that a woman of Joanna's status, when her husband is a highly placed official in the court, would have been spending a lot of time with someone who was a sex worker or that sort of background. So it actually suggests, and it's really the New Testament reference to these two, that they may have been comparable in terms of their social standing. So let's turn now to Jerusalem. And as we know, Mary Magdalene and Joanna both went to Jerusalem in 33. And what's sort of interesting part, while we're on the subject of Joanna, is where they might have stayed. Herod had a palace in Jerusalem, and it was near the present site of the David Tower in Jerusalem. This is a photo here. Now, a lot of what you're looking at here is medieval archaeology, but there are certainly archaeological discoveries from the first century and even beyond. And this area is where Herod's palace was situated. And what's interesting is we know Herod was there because Jesus was brought before Herod, before his trial in front of Pontius Pilate. Would Joanna have been staying at Herod's palace during her visit to Jerusalem at the same time? And if she was, would her friend Mary Magdalene have also been staying there? So that's an intriguing lens in terms of the whole narrative at the time of the crucifixion. What's particularly interesting, too, is that in 2015, an Israeli archaeologist was involved in unearthing what was below a prison cell near the David Tower, and he found an older prison cell, and he dated it to the 1st century. And a number of scholars actually believe that this was where Jesus was imprisoned prior to his trial before Pontius Pilate. What's particularly interesting about that is if that becomes a more well-accepted view than the current view, which is that his prison cell and his trial before Pilate took place at the Antonia Fortress, that actually changes all the sites in the Stations of the Cross, because the Praetorium may have been an administrative center next to Herod's palace as opposed to the Antonia Fortress. So that's still an argument that I think we're going to see developing over about the next century or so, and it links to this particular find, archaeological discovery, that was made in 2015. There's three particular, I would say, three of the most well-known and most important artifacts in biblical archaeology that are very mysterious and very interesting, and in which Mary Magdalene may have played a role. And we're going to talk about all three of those: Veronica's veil, the Shroud of Turin, and the site of Jesus' tomb. So, and when we think about the Stations of the Cross and the Via Dolorosa, all three of these artifacts play a role in that story as they unfold. So let's start with Veronica's veil. This is actually Station 6 of the Stations of the Cross on the Via Dolorosa. And of course, Veronica was the woman who wiped Jesus' face as he was on his way to Calvary. As depicted here is the woman wiping his face, and here's Simon of Cyrene with the cross. And this is the actual site on the Via Dolorosa, Station 6. Now, legend, of course, has it that after Veronica wiped the face of Jesus, the image of his face was imprinted onto her veil. One thing that is fairly well established is that her name was probably not Veronica, even though we've referred to her as Saint Veronica for nearly 2,000 years. The term Veronica probably referred to the fact that she received the true image of Christ on her veil. Vera is the Latin word for true, and icon is the Greek word for image. And in fact, as you read about these different veils or cloths that are purported to be either the veil or a representation of it, scholars actually refer to the cloth itself as the Veronica, as opposed to the name of a person. So who was Veronica if that wasn't really her name? Well, many believe that even though she may not have been named Veronica, she was a compassionate stranger who didn't know who Jesus was. She saw him in distress and was moved to offer a random act of kindness. And there's something, I think, particularly beautiful in that interpretation, because it shows us how a random act of kindness to a stranger, we're still talking about this for 2,000 years, and it shows the impact of kindness in everyday life, which is what a stranger would have shown. But there's certainly a school of thought that believes that the woman who wiped Jesus' face at Station 6 was actually the woman with the hemorrhage who had been healed when she touched the hem of Jesus' robe in the marketplace sometime earlier. The theory is that she was in Jerusalem for the Passover. She saw Jesus, on his way to Calvary, and she wanted to offer him some small act of compassion to show her gratitude for the healing she received from him. And so that is certainly a theory that I've read several times about who the woman might have been. And of course, other scholars have expressed the view that it may have been Mary Magdalene who wiped the face of Jesus on his way to Calvary. I think without a doubt, Mary Magdalene was at the crucifixion. All four gospel writers place her there. And it's unlikely that she simply came to Calvary. I suspect she was actually at the Praetorium earlier in the day when Pontius Pilate tried Jesus. She was probably among the crowd where they all cried, "Give us Barabbas," and followed him through the stations until the crucifixion and stayed until the burial. That's certainly the premise of Mary Magdalene's Stations of the Cross, but I think it's quite a reasonable assumption. And so many people believe she may have been the person who wiped Jesus' face at Station 6, who we've come to call Veronica over the centuries. So where is Veronica's veil? Well, there are currently 6 different artifacts in different palaces and churches all around the world that claim to either be Veronica's veil or a true representation of it. One of these is actually in the Vatican in Rome, and it's displayed every year during the season of Lent. But one of the most interesting veils is this one here. This is called the Veil of Manoppello, and it was rediscovered in 1999 at a Capuchin monastery in Italy by Professor Heinrich Pfeiffer, who was a professor of Christian art at the Vatican's Gregorian University. Professor Pfeiffer takes the view that the veil was actually stolen from the Vatican in the 17th century while there was a renovation at St. Peter's Basilica, and ended up at this monastery in Italy where it was rediscovered only just over a decade ago, so 2 decades ago. So what's interesting about the Veil of Manoppello is that it's made of a fabric called byssus, or sea silk. This was the most costly fabric in the ancient world. And let me explain to you how it's made, and then you'll see why it costs so much. If you've ever eaten mussels, you'll recall that they have these kind of, dark threads that you want to, take away before you eat them or cook them. And generally they don't look terribly appealing, but I guess if you were to wash them and clean them up, they turn into a almost golden or translucent texture. And there is a large species of Mediterranean clam that is found down off, I think, Sardinia, and they produce very large threads for these clams, and they're harvested by divers and have been for, thousands of years. And in ancient times, they would dive down, bring up the clams or bring up the threads, clean them. They would turn into an almost translucent golden fabric, and they were woven. That was byssus. That was sea silk. And that was why it was so very expensive. That's what the Veil of Manoppello is made of. Now, byssus has been found in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. It's also mentioned as being used in the vestments of Jewish high priests. What's interesting about byssus is that it can't be painted on. It's too delicate. So the argument, of course, is, well, how could this image be made? Certainly couldn't have been made by paint. However, because this veil of Manoppello is made of byssus, it's also far too delicate for either carbon-14 testing or any other testing to determine its age. So we have no insights about that whatsoever. However, if the veil of Manoppello is actually Veronica's veil, one thing we know about this woman who wiped the face of Jesus is that she had to be extremely wealthy if she had a veil made of byssus. One other facet of the veil of Manoppello that's particularly interesting is found in this book by Paul Batty. And if you're interested in the veil, this is one of the best books on the subject. It's called The Face of God. And he talks about a test that was done on the veil of Manoppello by a Trappist nun named Blandina Pascalis Schlomer. I probably butchered her name, I apologize. She did an experiment where she overlaid the face on the veil of Manoppello against the face on the Shroud of Turin. And she used various measurements and other things in her experiment, and she determined that the images on both cloths were of the same man. On the Shroud of Turin, the man is dead, his eyes are closed. And on the veil of Manoppello, the man is alive and his eyes are open. So that's another just interesting sideline to the veil of Manoppello. And that brings us to the Shroud of Turin. Without a doubt, the most famous Christian relic in the world. It is a 14-foot linen cloth on which is imprinted the image of a man who died by crucifixion. And if you see the shroud or see a good replica of the shroud, you will see immediately that all of the wounds on the shroud are consistent with the biblical references to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So here is a depiction of the shroud and the face on the shroud. What I'm showing you here is actually station 13 of the Stations of the Cross. This is called the Anointing Stone, and it's found in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. And this stone itself was placed in 1810, but it covers a stone that was there, and many people feel was there back to the 1st century. This is the place where it is believed that Jesus' body was prepared for burial. If you think of the famous statue of the Pieta, where Jesus' mother Mary is holding his lifeless body, that scene would have occurred right about here, and this would have been the place where the Shroud of Turin was wrapped around the body. So what does this tell us, or what do we know in terms of scientific study about the Shroud of Turin? Well, one of the most famous tests on the Shroud of Turin was conducted in 1988. This was a carbon-14 dating test, and a sample was cut in three, and 3 different labs looked at it, and they all came back and said that the fabric was produced in the 13th or 14th century. And consequently, many people said, the Shroud of Turin must be a medieval forgery, because that's what the carbon-14 dating showed. However, almost from the time that that test was conducted, people have disputed its validity. Carbon-14, while it has been shown to be very accurate on some things, has also shown to be inaccurate, and particularly with respect to a linen cloth. There was an Egyptian cloth that scientists knew for sure its dating, because they were very clear that it pertained to a particular pharaoh. And the carbon-14 test on that Egyptian linen cloth wasn't out by a little bit, it was out by 1,000 years. So again, that was obviously brought into play about this test. Also, the Shroud of Turin was damaged in a fire in the 1530s, and it was repaired 2 years later by an order of French nuns. They used a backing cloth to give it more strength, and it was explained that the sample from the carbon-14 test in 1988 was from one of the rewoven sections. Whether that's true or not, the shroud had clearly been through a fire. It was in a silver box. There were molten silver drops that fell on it, and that sort of activity can interfere with carbon-14 dating as well. So one thing's for sure is that people are still fascinated, and many Christians believe strongly in the validity of the Shroud of Turin. Even a few months ago, during the COVID-19 outbreak, the shroud was put on virtual display because people found it comforting to look at the shroud during a time of tremendous ordeal in the world. So it certainly hasn't lost any of its believers. But two of the most interesting finds that I encountered when I went to this particular exhibition, which is in Jerusalem, and it's called The Man of the Shroud. If you have a chance to see this at Notre Dame in Jerusalem, don't miss it. It's so well done. And two of the really interesting findings, which have some implications for Mary Magdalene, particularly the second one, were the coins over the eyes and the botany of the shroud. So let's leave the carbon-14 to the side for now, and let's look at something else. So this is obviously a photograph of the face on the Shroud of Turin, and there were these kind of button-like structures, one right on the eye, one just above the eye. And in 1978, scientists used an image analyzer developed by NASA to take a look at these, and they were able to actually discern images and writing, and they determined that they were coins. And they were then able to actually determine what kind of coins they were. This one here is called a dilipton litus, and it was a low-value coin, so like a penny. It would have been minted between 29 and 32 at the direction of Pontius Pilate. And as you can recall, Pilate was appointed the governor of Judea in 26, so he was responsible for a number of coins that were minted. So this would have put that coin exactly accurate in terms of the timing of the crucifixion and Jesus' burial. Similarly, the other coin was called a lepton simpulum, I think, and it was minted in 29 also by Pontius Pilate. So again, if this was a medieval forgery, would the forger in medieval Europe been careful enough to put these two coins from exactly the right time frame of Jesus' burial? Did they have access to those coins? Perhaps during the Crusades, which had happened in an earlier, few hundred years earlier. Hard to say, but I think it's pretty interesting evidence to look at when you're considering the shroud. It also tells us that someone involved in the burial put those coins over the eyes. Was that Joseph of Arimathea? Was that Nicodemus? Was that Mary Magdalene, or one of the other women? Which brings us to the second finding, the botany of the shroud. This is particularly interesting. So as you'll see here, this is a look at the photograph of the Shroud of Turin, and all these red or pinkish marks that are showing up here were actually species of plants or flowers that were found on the Shroud of Turin. And there was a team of botanists led by Professor Avinoam Danon from, I think he's at Hebrew University. He's one of the leading botanists in Israel. And he and his team studied the images from a 1931 photograph of the Shroud of Turin. They were able to identify 30 species of plants from that. And in the 1970s, they took sticky tape samples of pollen and grains that were on the surface of the Shroud of Turin, and they analyzed those as well. And they identified 58 species from those experiments. Here's the really interesting part. All of the plants that they identified from these scientific studies were all native to Israel. There wasn't a plant that they said, oh, this one's out of place. It's only found in Europe. They were all native to Israel. And particularly interesting is that there were 4 species that you'll only find together in one place in the world. It's a 6 to 12 mile area around Jerusalem and Hebron. So that was a very interesting study as well. And in addition, these flowers bloom in March and April, which is consistent with the timing of the crucifixion, the burial. Which brings us to this question: who put the flowers in the Shroud of Turin? Was it Mary Magdalene? Probably it was. If the shroud is authentic, someone put flowers around the body at the time of the burial. And we know from the New Testament that there was a garden in the vicinity of Jesus' tomb. We know Mary Magdalene was at the crucifixion, and 3 of the 4 gospel writers actually place her outside the tomb even after the burial. So she probably played a role in the burial itself. We know that Joseph, Arimathea, and Nicodemus were also there, but I think the gathering of flowers and the placing of flowers was a particularly sort of female thing. It's something a woman would probably have been more likely to have done. We know that John indicates that Nicodemus brought 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe to anoint the body. That's the only reference to spices and oils that were available for the burial. We also know that anointing with flowers is not a traditional Jewish burial custom. However, some scholars suggest that if scented oils weren't available, flowers might have been used in an effort to try to offset the odor of the body as it decays. And there was obviously a garden right there. And if you think about this, was this the reason that Mary Magdalene returned to the tomb on Easter morning with the myrrh? Was she returning to replace the flowers that she put around the body on Friday when they buried Jesus? Was she going to replace those with myrrh and anoint the body properly? So I think that's another really interesting thing to think about coming out of the Shroud of Turin. The last item that I'd like to talk about relative to the Stations of the Cross is the site of Jesus' tomb. The most famous passage between Mary Magdalene in the Bible is where she encounters the risen Jesus on Easter Sunday morning. Well, where did that happen? Why are there two different sites for Jesus' tomb in the city of Jerusalem? And there are. The traditional site is this site right here, the tomb of Jesus at the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. And when you look at it, as you can see, it's very ornate. And it's kind of hard to imagine the scene taking place there because it's just not, what I think most of us envisioned when we think about that encounter between Mary Magdalene and Jesus on Easter morning. Over here, we have what's called the Garden Tomb in East Jerusalem, and it's very easy to picture Mary Magdalene encountering Jesus in this outside of this tomb. It looks pretty much like what you probably imagined. So why are there two? And which one is the actual site where Mary Magdalene encountered Jesus on Easter morning? So let's talk first about the traditional site in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. That is the very ornate tomb that I showed you earlier. One of my favorite, I think, historical characters is Saint Helena. She was 76 years old in 326, and she came to the Holy Land essentially as an amateur archaeologist. She wanted to find the site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And she happened to be the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine. And as I'm sure you'll recall, Constantine was the emperor who legalized Christianity. And Helena had been a practicing Christian for many years before her son actually legalized it. And she wanted, in her advanced age of 76 years old, to go to the Holy Land and find these sites. She wanted to try to bring back the true cross. And there's a lot written about her. We won't go into all of that. But her son, Constantine, gave her a Roman legion to help her out. And that proved to be very useful to Helena. By the way, St. Helena is the person that Mount St. Helens in Washington State is named for. Just another point of reference. Helena gets to Jerusalem. She's trying to find where the tomb was, and she's told that in 135, the Emperor Hadrian had built a temple to the Roman goddess Venus over the site of Jesus' tomb. So she takes her legion of Roman soldiers and tells them to demolish this temple and dig. And sure enough, Helena's Roman legion finds a rock-hewn tomb under the Temple of Venus. And that is the site that I just showed you, the very ornately decorated site in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. And her son has a church built over that for its protection and reverence, and that's the Church of the Holy Sepulcher that we see today, and the traditional site of Jesus' tomb. So what's the garden tomb? This one, how did that one evolve? Well, in 1883, there was a British general named Charles Gordon, and he was stationed in that area, and he identified a hill in East Jerusalem that in certain lighting, it kind of looked like a skull. And that was interesting to him because the term Golgotha, or Calvary, where Jesus was crucified, it means the place of the skull. So General Gordon suggested that this might be an alternate site, that maybe Helena got it wrong. And in fact, very interestingly, several rock-hewn tombs were discovered in the area, including this one, the garden tomb. Now, this scene, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of what you imagine, where you can picture Mary Magdalene and Jesus in this, beautiful encounter on Easter morning. Unfortunately, however, 20th century archaeologists have pretty much debunked this one. They have dated the garden tomb to between 700 and 800 BC. So it was far too old to have actually been the tomb of Jesus. And as you may recall from the New Testament, the gospel writers say that Jesus' body was placed in a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. And if this tomb was already about 700 years old at that point, that was unlikely. So while it's a lovely place to visit if you go to Jerusalem, and it's very evocative of the encounter, it's probably not the actual tomb of Jesus. Let's go back and look at Magdala today. What happened there? Was Father Juan able to build his pilgrimage center? Indeed, he was. They opened the archaeological park. There is an active archaeological dig going on at the site. It's fantastic, and they find new things almost every day. Last November, they opened a hotel and retreat center. You can see a picture of it here. If you go down here, you can see the Sea of Galilee in the background. So they've done a beautiful job with that. This is a chapel called Duc in Altum that they built at the site. As you can see, the altar is shaped like a boat. There's an infinity pool behind it going out to the Sea of Galilee. So if you attend a service there, it's like someone's preaching from the boat. So that's a lovely concept. And it also has a separate chapel to Mary Magdalene. This particular mosaic evokes the encounter where Jesus releases Mary Magdalene from the 7 demons. And probably my favorite part of the Duc in Altum chapel at Magdala is the women's atrium. This is it here, and it's the only site that I'm aware of anywhere in the world that pays homage and celebrates the women of the New Testament. And it's particularly lovely. Each of these pillars is inscribed with the name of one of the women referenced in the New Testament who was a follower and supporter of Jesus. So Mary Magdalene is mentioned here, Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chusa, and the other women in the New Testament. And this golden mosaic here is a Latin phrase that goes around the women's atrium, and it translates roughly to this quote from St. Pope John Paul II. In this holy place, the Church gives thanks for the feminine genius, for the eternal dignity of women, and for the great works God has done through them throughout history for humanity. So that concludes my presentation on Mary Magdalene and archaeology. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this talk and you want to learn more about the book, Mary Magdalene Stations of the Cross, it's available on an ebook or Kindle format, paperback or hardcover. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments to ann@annregimbal.com, or go to my website, annregimbal.com, if you'd like to see more webinars, because we'll be putting some more out throughout the course of the year. Thank you so much.